I woke with red clay beneath my fingernails and no memory of putting it there. For several quiet seconds, I stared at my hands. They were younger than mine had been, slimmer too. The palms were covered in old burns, tiny cuts, and the smooth calluses of someone who worked with wet earth every day. A bronze bell rang somewhere beyond the window. Then a second set of memories hit me. My name was Kito Balen. I was 18 years old, a first-year student at Redcliff Academy, and in less than an hour I was expected to attend the ceremony that would determine my magical discipline. That was unfortunate, because the last thing I remembered was being 32, living in an apartment with unreliable plumbing, and falling asleep beside a small electric pottery kiln after spending the evening testing glaze samples. I had apparently crossed worlds. I had also apparently crossed worlds directly into the body of someone who was about to fail the most important morning of his life. The original Kito had been quiet, polite, and almost painfully forgettable. His parents made roof tiles in a village south of the academy. They had spent 12 years saving enough copper rings to send their only son here. Unfortunately, magical talent was valued according to spectacle. Flame students created fire. Wind students leaped from towers. Stone shapers raised walls with their hands. Metal enchanters made swords glow in several unnecessarily dramatic colors. Kito Balen could soften clay. That was his entire reputation. I sat up on the narrow dormitory bed and looked around. Morning light poured through a carved wooden screen. Red cliffs rose beyond the window, streaked with black stone and pale mineral lines. The academy buildings had been constructed directly against them, with round towers, shaded courtyards, clay-tiled roofs, and covered walkways painted with geometric earth symbols. Far below the dormitory stood dozens of sacred termite mounds. Some were taller than a person. Small clay figures had been placed around their bases, ancestors with long faces, earth spirits with wide eyes, and patient animals carrying bowls on their backs. Mana drifted through everything. I could not see it clearly, but I could feel it as a quiet pressure against my skin. It reminded me of standing beside a kiln that had almost reached firing temperature. Someone hammered on my door. "Kito, are you alive?" The voice belonged to Bako, one of the students from the room across the corridor. According to Kito's memories, Bako was training in spear magic and had never entered a room quietly in his life. "I believe so," I called. That sounded uncertain. "I have had a complicated morning." "Have it faster. The assignment ceremony begins in 40 minutes. I climbed out of bed. My academy robe hung from a wooden peg. It was plain cream cloth with a brown belt and a faded red collar. Someone had repaired the left sleeve using thread that did not quite match. On the desk sat 3 objects: a clay practice tablet, a student handbook, and a letter from Kito's mother. The letter contained only 4 lines. "Work carefully, eat properly, do not be ashamed of honest hands. Your father says the roof survived the rains." I read it twice. Then I placed it inside the handbook. I had no great system waiting for me. No glowing interface appeared. No mysterious voice announced that I had received the legendary Potter of Infinite Destruction class. I had another man's memories, some basic knowledge of material science, and 8 years of amateur pottery experience. It was not the most dramatic transmigration advantage. Still, as I picked up the clay tablet, I noticed something the original Kito had never considered. The Academy described clay as magically weak because it did not hold a rigid spell structure for long. But on Earth, weakness and flexibility were not the same thing. Clay changed under pressure. It stored water. It remembered shape. It shrank when dried, expanded when wet, strengthened when fired, and behaved differently depending on its minerals. particle size, temper, heat, and moisture. Stone resisted force. Clay responded to it. I pressed my thumb into the tablet. The surface yielded. A faint thread of mana entered the mark and remained there, glowing softly long after I removed my hand. For the first time that morning, I smiled. Perhaps Kito Balen had not been given a weak talent. Perhaps nobody at Redcliff Academy had bothered learning what clay could actually do. The assignment hall had been designed to make 18-year-olds feel small. Its pillars were carved directly from the red cliff. Terracotta ancestors stood in alcoves between them, each figure wearing a different expression of patient disappointment. 500 students filled the curved stone benches. At the center of the hall stood the discipline basin, a wide bowl containing 7 layers of enchanted earth. Students placed their hands above it, fed mana into the soil, and waited for one layer to respond. Black iron sand meant metal charms. White gravel meant stone shaping. Gold dust meant crystal work. Blue silt meant river magic. Red sand meant heat shaping. Green earth meant plant magic. Brown clay meant an early career of repairing practice tablets, while other people did impressive things nearby. I joined the line. Bako stood 6 places ahead of me, grinning as if he had personally organized the ceremony. He was broad-shouldered, cheerful, and unable to keep his hands still. Even while waiting, he practiced small spear movements with one finger. A thin girl behind me clutched a pouch of carved beads against her chest. I remembered her name. Sira. She had been accepted into bead enchantment, a field considered respectable but delicate. Her mana control was excellent, but she became nervous whenever anyone watched her work. Unfortunately, academy education involved a great deal of people watching you work. "You can go before me," she whispered. "Why?" "I need another minute. You have been in this line for 20 minutes. I need a 21st minute." I stepped aside. Sira stared at me, surprised. "Thank you. Take 22 if necessary." The line moved. Bako reached the basin and placed his hand over it. The white gravel trembled. The black sand jumped. Then a narrow ridge of red sand rose like the head of a spear. "Force projection," announced Dean Kessa from the platform. "Spear discipline." Bako raised both arms as if he had won a national election. A few minutes later, Sira approached the basin. 3 polished beads floated from her pouch before she even touched the testing circle. They circled her wrist in a precise triangle. "Bead enchantment," Dean Kessa said. Sira exhaled so hard that the beads nearly fell. Then it was my turn. I held my hand above the basin. The brown clay rose immediately. Not a little. All of it. It climbed out of the bowl, wrapped around my wrist, and formed a thick glove. The hall became very quiet. Then someone in the upper benches laughed. Not cruelly. It was closer to the sound someone made when a goat walked into a kitchen. Dean Kessa looked at the clay, then at me. "Clay sigil discipline," she announced. Several students gave me sympathetic looks. One young man wearing a silver-edged robe leaned toward his friend. "That much clay affinity," he whispered. "What a waste." His name was Varo Jalen. His family owned 3 stone quarries and had funded the Academy's Eastern Practice Hall. He had tested into advanced stone shaping before the ceremony even began. He was not a terrible person. He had simply been raised to believe that anything expensive was probably better. At the edge of the platform, Instructor Neem Aura waited for me. She was a short woman with gray beginning at her temples, clay on both sleeves, and the expression of someone who had survived many budget meetings. "Welcome to Clay Sigils," she said. "Thank you. We make practice charms, temporary labels, kiln seals, roof markers, cheap warming tiles, and emergency patch runes. That sounds useful. She narrowed her eyes. You are either unusually sensible, or you have not understood how little respect we receive. Possibly both. Instructor Neem led me through a side door, while the next student approached the basin. Our classroom was located behind the main earth magic halls, then behind the storage rooms, then behind another storage room that appeared to contain nothing but damaged buckets. The clay workshop itself was warm and pleasant. Shelves covered the walls. Hundreds of molds, stamps, tablets, bowls, and unfinished figures sat beneath open windows. The room smelled of damp earth, charcoal, and old smoke. Only 4 students waited inside. Instructor Neem placed a lump of brown clay on my table. The basic clay sigil has 3 stages, she said. Shape. Mark charge. Clay is forgiving while wet, but its mana structure weakens as it dries. Fired clay lasts longer but holds less active mana than carved stone. She pressed a simple warming symbol into the clay. The tablet glowed. After 30 seconds, the glow faded. Useful, she said, but unimpressive. I touched the tablet. The surface was warmer near the center and cooler along the edges. A thin crescent of moisture had formed beneath it. Where did this clay come from? The western river bank. Do you always use river clay for warming sigils? We use whatever the groundskeepers deliver. What happens if you use hill clay? Instructor Neem paused. It becomes slightly redder. Anything else? Nothing worth documenting. That was an answer I had heard many times in my previous life, usually shortly before discovering that someone had changed a material without updating the manufacturing process. I made my own tablet. Instead of carving one deep warming rune, I pressed 9 shallow marks in a spiral. Then I added mana slowly. The clay warmed from the outside inward. It held the heat for 12 seconds longer than Instructor Neem's tablet. One of the other students leaned closer. Instructor Neem picked it up. Why a spiral? To reduce the distance between each active line. That is not how sigils are normally designed. No, I said, but the clay does not seem to know that. For the first time, Instructor Neem smiled. It was a small, dangerous smile. The smile of a teacher who had just found a student willing to help prove that the official textbook was lazy. I met Bako and Sira properly over lunch. The academy cafeteria served thick bean stew, roasted plantains, flatbread, and a pepper sauce that made my new body remember 3 separate childhood illnesses. Bako placed his tray beside mine without asking. I heard your clay attacked you during the ceremony. It embraced me. Very aggressively. Sira sat across from us. She arranged her spoon, cup, bread, and bead pouch into a perfectly straight line before touching the food. I thought it looked impressive, she said. Bako nodded. Yes, like a glove made of expensive mud. Thank you, Bako. You are welcome. He tore his bread in half and handed me the larger piece. Bako's spear discipline was more prestigious than mine, but his first lesson had gone badly. Force projection required releasing mana in a straight, controlled burst. Bako's mana preferred celebrations. His first practice thrust had launched a wooden spear through 2 target screens and into a laundry basket. No one was injured, he explained. Were the clothes injured? A sock may never recover. Sira had problems of her own. Her bead enchantments were precise when she worked alone. During class demonstrations, her fingers stiffened. She pulled her strings too tightly, overcharged the beads, and caused the pattern to collapse. I know what I'm doing, she said quietly. Then the instructor looks at me, and suddenly my hands belong to someone else. That happened to me this morning, I said, although in my case they literally did. She looked confused. I had not told anyone I was a transmigrator, explaining that I had once lived in a world without mana, where people built kilns using electricity and argued online about coffee, seemed unnecessary. After lunch, we visited the lower market for supplies. The Academy market occupied a narrow street between the dormitory cliff and the sacred mounds. Shopkeepers sold second-hand spell rods, chipped practice crystals, blank talisman paper, bead wire, dried herbs, charcoal, lamp oil, and pastries filled with spiced ground nuts. We entered a cramped craft shop called 7 Useful Things. It contained at least 900 things. The owner, Auntie Yarrow, wore 6 measuring cords around her neck and could apparently identify a customer's budget by the way they opened the door. "You have 6 copper rings," she told me. "I have 8. You need 2 for food." I purchased a wooden shaping knife, a cracked rolling board, 3 small mesh screens, and a bundle of used kiln cones. Sira found thin copper wire for half the normal price because the spool had been tangled. Bako bought a second-hand spear grip and a pastry. He ate the pastry before we left the shop, which made me question whether it counted as a purchase or an event. Behind the western dormitory stood an abandoned kiln house. The roof leaned slightly. Weeds grew between the floor stones, and one shutter had been replaced with a woven grain mat. The kiln itself was a round clay structure large enough to fire 60 bowls. According to Kito's memories, it had been abandoned after the Academy built a newer stone furnace. To me, it looked perfect. Instructor Neem gave us permission to use it on one condition: do not burn down the dormitory. Bako raised a hand. "How much of the dormitory?" "All of it." "What about a very small corner?" "No." We cleaned the kiln house that afternoon. Bako carried broken shelves outside. Sira sorted old bead molds. I scraped soot from the firing chamber and checked the walls for cracks. By sunset, we had found 23 forgotten clay molds, 4 usable tools, 2 bags of charcoal, and a family of lizards who clearly considered us trespassers. Our first experiment was simple. We gathered equal amounts of clay from the Western River, the Red Hill Path, and the Academy Garden. I shaped 3 tokens with identical warming sigils, dried them beside the kiln, and charged each one with the same amount of mana. The garden clay warmed quickly and cracked. The river clay warmed slowly and remained slightly flexible. The Red Hill clay became hot enough to burn a dark circle into Bako's practice cloth. Bako stared at the mark. "Should we be worried?" "We should be interested." That is what worried people say when they own notebooks. I did own a notebook. I wrote down the weight of each sample, the water added, drying time, sigil depth, charge duration, surface temperature, and visible damage. Sira watched me for several minutes. No clay instructor records that much. Then we may discover why. Our second experiment involved ash-mixed clay. I wanted to know whether the fine carbon particles would change the way mana moved through the body. Sira suggested pressing a sound symbol into the token. Bako suggested shouting at it. We combined both methods. The token absorbed his voice. When I activated it again, the clay repeated the last sound it had heard. Unfortunately, it did so in Bako's voice at twice the original volume. "Good evening, Clay." The shout echoed across the dormitory courtyard. A window opened above us. "Some of us are studying," someone yelled. The token repeated that too. "Some of us are studying." We buried it beneath a sack until it became quiet. Sira laughed so hard she had to sit on the floor. It was the first time I had seen her laugh without covering her mouth. That evening, we ate roasted ground nuts beside the cooling kiln. The room glowed orange from the last coals. Rain tapped gently against the patched roof. For the first time since waking in another world, I did not feel like I had stolen someone else's life. I felt like I had been invited into it. Our experiments became a routine. Classes ended at 4 bells. We ate an early meal. Then we went to the old kiln house until the evening lamps were lit. I learned quickly that knowing about clay and controlling mana were separate skills. On Earth, I had used scales, thermometers, humidity gauges, and a kiln controller. At Redcliff Academy, I had a wooden cup my fingertips and Bako saying things like, "It looks dry enough." Bako believed everything looked dry enough. My first batch of fired tokens exploded because I had trapped moisture inside them. The sound was not loud, but pieces of clay flew from the kiln opening like angry beans. One landed in my hair. One struck Bako's boot. 3 fell directly into Sira's carefully organized bead tray. She looked at the fragments. Then she looked at me. I had arranged those by size. "I am sorry." "I know." "Are you angry?" "I have not decided." She spent the next 20 minutes rearranging the beads with frightening calm. I adjusted the drying schedule. For the next batch, I added crushed fired clay to the wet mixture. In pottery, those particles were called temper or grog. They reduced shrinkage and gave escaping steam more paths to travel through. The academy had no formal name for the method because most clay sigils were never fired carefully enough for it to matter. Our second batch survived. That was our first real milestone. The tokens were ugly, uneven, and slightly crooked. They were also twice as strong as the academy's standard practice charms. Sira tested them with bead mana. Her enchantments entered the clay slowly instead of rushing toward the central sigil. The fired particles interrupted the flow just enough to spread it across the whole token. "It is like adding pauses to a song," she said. That observation changed everything. We began testing local clay from different places. River clay accepted healing mana easily. When pressed against a bruised wrist, it released a soft, cooling pulse for almost 3 minutes. Red Hill clay stored heat. Mixed with fine sand, it created warming tiles that stayed comfortable rather than becoming hot enough to cook lunch. Garden clay was rich and smooth, but shrank badly. Cliff clay was strong, coarse, and difficult to shape. The most interesting sample came from the termite mounds. We did not simply dig into one. The sacred mounds were protected by academy law, and more importantly, by groundskeeper Amara, who carried a shovel that could probably defeat several advanced students. I explained what we wanted. She studied me. "You wish to take clay from an earth spirit's home. Only loose material from an abandoned outer ridge. And what will you give back?" Bako opened his mouth. I stepped on his foot before he could offer a pastry. "We can repair the rain channels around the smaller mounds," I said. "Water is collecting near their bases." Groundskeeper Amara nodded. 3 mornings of work. We spent 3 mornings clearing leaves, rebuilding shallow drainage paths, and carrying stones along the garden trail. On the 4th morning, she gave us a basket of pale brown mound clay gathered from a collapsed, unoccupied section. The difference was immediate. Termites did not build with random dirt. They selected particles, moved minerals, mixed earth with organic binders, and packed it layer by layer. The mound clay was already a carefully processed composite material. Our first barrier token made from it did not resist mana. It distributed mana. When Bako struck the token with a weak spear pulse, the force spread through its entire surface and faded around the edges. He struck it harder. The token flexed. A thin crack appeared, then stopped. Normal clay would have broken. Stone would have transferred the impact into whatever held it. The mound clay absorbed part of the force and released the rest as a slow pulse. Sira crouched beside it. The mana is still moving. She placed 3 enchanted beads around the token. The beads lit one after another. Not simultaneously. In sequence. I opened my notebook. Again. Bako lowered his spear. You say that too often. Again. He struck the token 12 more times. By the final attempt, Sira had mapped the exact route of the pressure through her beads. In return, the tokens helped both of them. I made small clay spacers for Sira's bead strings. The spacers prevented her from pulling the wire too tight and absorbed excess mana when her hands became tense. Her next classroom pattern remained stable for 47 seconds. Her previous record had been 11. For Bako, I shaped a clay ring around his practice spear grip. The soft clay recorded where his fingers squeezed hardest. He learned that he was tensing his right hand just before releasing mana, which twisted his force projection. Within 2 weeks, he could strike the center of a target without harming nearby laundry. Progress deserved accurate measurement. Instructor Neem visited the kiln house one rainy evening. She examined our shelves, notes, failed pieces, and carefully labeled baskets of clay. You have made more records in 14 days than this department produced last year. Is that good? It is embarrassing, she said, but useful. She picked up a mound clay barrier token. When she charged it, the mana spread beneath her fingers like water beneath cloth. Her expression changed. Where did you learn to think about clay this way? I considered lying. Instead, I gave her part of the truth. In another life, I learned that materials behave according to their structure, even when people give them simple names. Instructor Neem looked at me for a long moment. Then she placed the token back on the table. I have taught at this academy for 23 years, she said. That is not the strangest answer a student has given me. She pointed toward my notebook. Continue. The academy's western gate failed for the first time during breakfast. It did not collapse. It sneezed. A deep pulse rolled through the cliff, the cafeteria cups rattled, and every warming charm in the room flashed bright orange. Then a sound like a giant clearing its throat echoed across the courtyard. Bako looked up from his porridge. Was that supposed to happen? No, Sira said. How certain are you? The spoons are floating. Around us, 30 metal spoons hovered above the tables. Then they dropped into the porridge. The western gate was more than a door. It stood between 2 red cliff faces at the academy's main entrance. A protective formation ran through its pillars, across the arch, beneath the road, and into the academy walls. Every student, merchant, visitor, supply cart, and delivery animal passed beneath it. The formation checked identification tokens, softened earth tremors, dispersed hostile spells, and prevented large magical creatures from wandering into the courtyard. It had worked for 112 years. Lately, it had begun pulsing at random. The academy had already replaced 6 stone charms and 2 metal control plates. Each repair lasted less than a week. By midday, the western entrance was closed. Students returning from the lower town had to use the northern garden gate, adding nearly an hour to the walk. The cafeteria's vegetable cart could not fit through that entrance. The following morning, breakfast consisted of dry bread, thin millet porridge, and an apology. The problem was not dangerous yet. It was simply inconvenient in 17 different ways. At Redcliff Academy, that was enough to create panic. The Rain Welcome Festival was 12 days away. Families, craft guilds, and prospective students would arrive through the western gate. If it remained closed, the academy would have to cancel half the public events. The gate repair became an official academy project. Advanced stone shapers were assigned to reinforce the pillars. Metal enchanters replaced the control plates. Barrier students redrew the foundation circles. Varro Jalen was chosen to lead the student stone team. He accepted the position with the serious expression of someone being asked to save civilization rather than repair an entrance. I might have ignored the whole matter if Instructor Neem had not taken our class to observe the repair. Clay sigil students should understand major formations, she told us, mostly so you know which parts you will never be allowed to touch. We stood behind a safety cord while the prestigious disciplines worked. Varro pressed both hands against the eastern pillar. White mana moved through the stone, smoothing several cracks. His technique was excellent. The gate remained stable for almost 4 minutes. Then another pulse passed through it. The new stone reinforcement cracked beside his hand. Not because it was weak. Because it was too rigid. I moved closer to the cord. The gate's mana was not striking the pillar once. It was building gradually, releasing, then returning in a smaller wave. Pressure accumulated in the stone until the strongest section forced the stress into the weakest one. I had seen similar failures in fired ceramic pieces, concrete structures, and badly designed shelves carrying too many books. Varro stepped back. Dean Kessa frowned at the crack. The foundation is shifting. No, I said. The word escaped before I could stop it. Several people turned toward me. Dean Kessa raised an eyebrow. Varro looked tired rather than offended. You notice something? He asked. The pressure is cycling. Earth formations do that. This one releases twice. I stepped nearer the pillar. The first pulse is strong. The second is weaker and arrives after the stone has already tightened against the first impact. Varro folded his arms. Stone does not tighten. The formation does. I pointed toward the new crack. You are reinforcing the gate against the strongest pulse. That makes the structure less able to adjust when the second pulse arrives. One of the senior instructors shook his head. The gate requires greater strength, not softer materials. I did not say softer. You are a first-year clay student. That statement was true, although not especially useful. Dean Kessa examined the pillar. What do you suggest? I would like to measure the pulses. With what? I thought of the ash-mixed sound tokens. Clay. The senior instructor made a quiet sound of disappointment. Varro looked at me for another moment. Then he said, it cannot make the problem worse. That was not an enthusiastic endorsement. Still, it was permission. Dean Kessa granted us 2 hours at the gate after evening classes. When we arrived, Bako carried 12 ashclay recording tokens in a basket. Sira brought 40 enchanted beads. I brought my notebook. The 3 of us stood beneath the largest magical structure at Redcliff Academy, while rainwater dripped from the arch and the evening lamps came alive along the road. Bako looked up. So what exactly are we doing? We are listening to the gate. He nodded slowly. Of course we are. We placed the recording tokens along both pillars, beneath the road stones, and around the central control plate. Sira linked each token to a bead. When mana passed through one, the matching bead would glow. Bako's job was to activate the gate's testing sequence and strike marked sections with controlled spear pulses. His official instruction said to use minimal force. Bako considered this a personal attack. For the first 6 tests, nothing useful happened. 2 tokens absorbed rainwater and became unreadable. One recorded the sound of Bako sneezing. Another repeated Instructor Neem saying, "Do not touch that," even though nobody admitted touching anything. The 7th test revealed the pattern. Bako struck the lower western pillar. The first pressure wave moved through the stone arch in less than a second. 14 beads flashed at once. Then there was a pause. Not a long one. Slightly less than 3 heartbeats. A second wave returned through the foundation. This one moved more slowly, passing from bead to bead in a twisting path beneath the road. Sira leaned over the pattern. It is coming from outside the gate. From the cliffs, Bako asked. Lower. I moved the underground tokens and repeated the test. The second wave was not an echo from the gate. It came from the sacred mounds. At first, that made no sense. Then groundskeeper Amara explained that the earth spirits beneath the academy shifted their mana paths at the beginning of every rainy season. Usually, the gate formation adjusted automatically. This year, the academy had replaced several old clay foundation pieces with prestigious stone charms. The original builders had included clay for a reason. The clay pieces had acted as buffers between the rigid gate and the moving mana beneath the ground. Over time, administrators had mistaken them for cheap components. They had replaced flexibility with strength. The gate had begun fighting the earth beneath it. I explained the idea to Dean Kessa the next morning. She listened with both hands folded on her desk. Varro and 3 senior instructors stood nearby. So the stone repairs are causing the failure? Varro asked. Not exactly, I said. The stone is doing what stone does well. It holds shape and resists force. That sounds like a compliment. It is. He looked slightly disappointed that I had not insulted him. But the gate does not need every part to resist. Some parts need to absorb pressure, spread it, and release it slowly. One instructor tapped my notebook. And clay can do this. Termite mound clay can, especially if we mix it with fired temper and shape the mana paths correctly. Unfired clay will dissolve in rain. We can fire the outer body and leave a sealed inner layer partially flexible. That earned several doubtful looks. It was a difficult design. A fully fired token would be strong but less responsive. A wet token would respond well but shrink, crack, or wash away. I proposed a layered sigil. The outer shell would be fired mound clay mixed with coarse temper. The inner disc would contain fine river clay to accept and release mana. Red hill clay channels would guide excess heat away from the gate's metal plates. Ash-mixed lines would record the pressure pattern and help the tokens adjust to repeated pulses. Instructor Neem stared at the drawing. You are placing 4 clay bodies in one piece. Yes. They shrink at different rates. Yes. They may tear themselves apart in the kiln. Yes. She rubbed her forehead. I am pleased that you understand the problem. Dean Kessa gave us 6 days to produce a working prototype. Varro's team would continue building an improved stone solution. Whichever design passed the inspection would be installed before the festival. Varro met me outside the office. I hope you understand that my team will not work less seriously because you are first years. I would be offended if you did. My family stone seals protect 3 city walls. That is impressive. Your proposed solution uses mud from an insect mound. Also impressive. He almost smiled. Then he glanced at my notebook. If the clay fails, the gate may remain closed for the festival. If the stone fails, the same thing happens. Yes. That sounds like a reason for both of us to work carefully. His expression softened. You are strange, Balen. I have had a complicated month. The next 5 days became a blur of classes, meals, testing, and kiln smoke. Sira calculated bead spacing for the ash clay recording lines. Bako prepared temper by crushing failed tokens with a stone hammer. Instructor Neem taught us how to control the old kiln's uneven heat, using charcoal placement and vent stones. Our first layered prototype split cleanly in half. The second warped into a shallow bowl. The third survived firing, but released all its stored mana through one edge, launching itself across the room. It landed in a bucket. Bako looked inside. Should we record that as partial success? No. It moved pressure. It moved itself. Sira adjusted the inner bead pattern. I reduced the moisture in the river clay layer. Instructor Neem changed the firing schedule. The fourth prototype survived. We mounted it between two practice stones and struck it with repeated mana pulses. The token absorbed the first pulse. The beads around it lit in sequence. 3 heartbeats later, the second pulse arrived. Instead of cracking, the clay released the stored mana gradually through 6 outer channels. The practice stones remained still. No cracks appeared. No token flew into a bucket. Bako placed both hands on my shoulders. Kito. Yes. We have invented boring magic. I looked at the stable token. It had taken 5 people, 4 kinds of clay, 31 failed samples, 6 evenings, 3 burned fingers, and 1 small argument about bead spacing. It was not flashy. It was not fast. It was the most beautiful piece of magic I had seen since arriving in this world. The morning before the official test, rain entered the kiln house through the roof. Not a polite drip. A stream. It landed directly on the shelf, holding our finished prototypes. Sira discovered it first. Her shout brought all of us running. 6 of the 12 tokens were wet. 2 had developed surface cracks. 1 had absorbed enough water to swell against its storage frame. Bako lifted the roof bucket into place. We can make more. The kiln will not dry them in time, I said. The test began at noon the following day. Even with forced drying, new tokens would retain dangerous moisture. Sira held 1 damaged piece beneath the lamp. The outer shell is fine. Water entered through the bead channels. She sounded calm. Her hands were not. For the past week, she had spoken confidently during every experiment. Now that the Academy would watch us, her old fear had returned. We should withdraw, she said. No, Bako replied immediately. If they fail publicly, everyone will say clay sigils are useless. They already say that. That does not make it better. I understood her fear. Failure was not equal for every discipline. If Varro's stone design failed, people would say the design needed adjustment. If our clay design failed, they would say clay itself had failed. I turned the damaged token in my hands. The bead channels needed protection, but sealing them completely would stop Sira's enchantments from sensing the mana flow. What keeps water away from bead cords? I asked. Sira blinked. Wax. Does wax block mana? Not if it is thin. Bako pointed toward the market road. Auntie Yarrow sells lamp wax. She will be closed because of the rain. She sleeps above the shop. That does not mean we should wake her. Bako was already opening the door. It means she will hear us. Auntie Yarrow charged us twice the normal price. She also gave us hot tea and called us irresponsible children. Both responses were fair. We coated the exposed bead channels with a thin mixture of wax and powdered fired clay. Sira pressed mana through the coating. The beads still responded. Water rolled from the surface. By sunrise, we had repaired 8 tokens. We needed 48 for the full gate. The Academy had prepared 40 empty slots around the pillars and 8 beneath the road. Our original plan required each token to be individually layered and fired. There was no time. Then Bako looked at the baskets of failed pieces. Can we reuse those? Most were cracked, warped, or uneven. But they had already been fired. I broke one open. The inner clay had failed, but the outer mound clay shell remained strong. We did not need 48 perfect new tokens. We needed 48 stable containers. We ground the damaged inner layers away, packed fresh river clay into the old shells, added red hill channels by hand, and connected Sira's ash-mixed bead lines across their surfaces. The repaired tokens would not last for years. They did not need to. If they stabilized the gate, the Academy could build permanent versions later. Instructor Neem worked beside us without speaking. Groundskeeper Amara brought another basket of mound clay. A cafeteria worker delivered bread, bean cakes, and a covered pot of tea. Even Varro visited shortly before the test. His robe was dusty, and one sleeve had torn near the wrist. "Our final stone brace is ready," he said. "Good." He looked at the crowded table. "Are yours?" Some of them have had previous careers. He picked up a repaired token. "You are using broken pieces. We are using fired shells with proven structural strength." That sounds more respectable. It is the same sentence, wearing better clothes. Varro placed the token down carefully. "For what it is worth, I hope your design works. You are competing against us." "I am competing to repair the gate." That was the moment I began to like him. Not enough to give him my notebook, but enough. At noon, students gathered along the western courtyard. Teachers stood behind the safety lines. Festival workers waited with carts of decorations. Clearly hopping someone would solve the problem before their flowers wilted. Varro's stone solution was tested first. His team had built a segmented brace instead of one rigid reinforcement. The design was more flexible than their earlier attempts. The first gate pulse passed without damage. The second produced a thin crack near the western base. It was a good design. It was simply not flexible enough. Then our turn came. Sira stopped at the edge of the crowd. "I cannot do this with everyone watching." I held out one of her beads. "You already did it." "No, I did it in the kiln house. The gate does not care where you were standing when you made the pattern." She looked at the bead. Bako leaned closer. "If it helps, most of them are watching Kito because he is carrying a basket of mud." That did help. Sira laughed once, took the bead and walked toward the gate. We installed all 48 tokens. Sira linked their recording lines. Bako stood beside the test lever. Instructor Neem checked the final seal. Dean Kessa raised her hand. The courtyard became silent. "Begin." The first pulse struck the gate like distant thunder. White mana surged through the stone pillars. Varro's repaired brace held. For half a second, nothing happened in our clay tokens. Then the first row glowed. Not brightly. A warm amber light moved from one token to the next, climbing the eastern pillar, crossing the arch, and descending the western side. The gate's excess mana entered the river clay centers. The fired mound clay shells spread the pressure. Red hill channels drew heat away from the metal plates. Sira's beads lit in a slow sequence, mapping every movement. "First pulse stable," she called. Her voice shook slightly. She did not stop. We waited. 1 heartbeat. 2. 3. The returning pressure wave entered through the ground. The road stones trembled. Several students stepped back. Our lower tokens darkened as they absorbed the second pulse. For one uncomfortable moment, they appeared completely dead. Then thin lines of amber light spread across their surfaces. The stored mana did not rebound into the pillars. It passed sideways. Each token released a small amount into the next one, dividing the pressure into 48 manageable paths. The gate gave a low hum. Not a sneeze. Not a groan. A hum. The entire formation settled. Even the rain falling through the arch seemed to soften. Sira stared at the bead pattern. It is changing. I moved beside her. The ash clay lines had recorded the first pressure cycle. During the second, the mana followed the earlier route more smoothly. The clay was not thinking. It was responding to paths created by previous stress. In its own simple way, it remembered. Dean Kessa ordered another pulse. Bako pulled the lever. The gate stabilized faster. A third pulse followed. Then a fourth. By the sixth, the mana moved through the clay tokens in one smooth amber wave. No stone cracked. No metal plate overheated. No spoon floated anywhere in the academy. Dean Kessa walked beneath the arch. The identification formation recognized her token and opened the outer doors. A vegetable cart waited on the road beyond. Its driver stared through the entrance. "Can I come in now?" Dean Kessa looked toward us. "Yes," she said, "the gate is open." The cart rolled into the courtyard. Students cheered. Not because we had defeated a monster. Not because anyone had thrown lightning into the sky. They cheered because breakfast would contain vegetables again. I considered that a perfectly respectable reason. Bako lifted me off the ground. "Put me down." We repaired the gate. Gravity remains active. He put me down. Sira stood beside the western pillar, watching all 40 beads glow in a steady rhythm. Varro approached the nearest clay token. He placed 2 fingers against it and closed his eyes. "The pressure is moving through it," he said. "Yes." "My stone brace is still carrying most of the gate's weight." "Yes." "But the clay is preventing that weight from becoming a shock." "Yes." He opened his eyes. So neither material could solve the problem alone. That appears to be the case. Varro glanced at the senior instructor who had dismissed our proposal. Then he looked back at me. "My family's city wall seal suffer cracks after heavy storms." I waited. "Would you be willing to examine them?" "For a consultation fee." He laughed. "Now you sound like a proper academy student." Instructor Neem inspected the tokens one by one. When she reached the repaired shells, she noticed the old cracks beneath the wax coating. "You installed reused failures in the academy gate." "We installed tested components." She gave me the dangerous teacher smile again. "Excellent answer." Dean Kessa called the 3 of us to the center of the courtyard. I expected a formal speech. Instead, she held up one of our spare tokens. "For 112 years," she said, "this academy has taught students that stone provides strength and clay provides convenience." She turned the token over. "We were not entirely wrong. We were incomplete." That was better than praise. Praise could be forgotten. A corrected lesson entered the curriculum. She announced that the clay sigil workshop would receive funding for a new kiln, proper drying shelves, and 6 research tables. Sira's bead pattern would be registered as part of the gate design. Bako's pulse testing method would be added to first-year force control training. Varro's segmented brace would remain in place alongside our pressure tokens. No one had lost. The gate had gained several people willing to understand it. As the crowd dispersed, the cafeteria worker pushed the vegetable cart toward the kitchens. She stopped beside me and placed a warm pastry in my hand. It was filled with honey and ground nuts. "For breakfast," she said. "It is afternoon." "It is for tomorrow's breakfast. You may practice waiting." I ate it immediately. Some disciplines required more training than others. The rain welcome festival began the following morning. Families entered through the western gate beneath strings of blue cloth and fresh green branches. Every time the formation pulsed, 48 clay tokens released a soft amber glow. Most visitors did not notice them. That seemed appropriate. Good foundations were rarely the loudest part of a structure. My new workshop was not actually new. The academy repaired the roof of the old kiln house, replaced the broken shutter, and gave us 2 tables from a classroom scheduled for renovation. To us, it felt like a palace. Instructor Neem placed a wooden sign above the door. The markings read, "Applied Clay Sigil Research." Bako wanted to add, "No dormitories burned so far." Sira refused. She had changed during those weeks. She still became nervous when people watched her, but nervousness no longer meant stopping. At the festival demonstration, she stood before 30 visitors and explained how bead spacing mapped the gate's pressure cycle. Her voice trembled through the first sentence. By the 5th, people were taking notes. A representative from the bead makers guild asked whether her clay spacers could stabilize medical charms. Sira did not hide behind me. She told the representative that she would need 3 weeks of testing before giving an answer. It was the most confident refusal I had ever heard. Bako's spear control improved too. His clay practice grip revealed tension patterns after every session. By the end of the term, he could release force in 7 measured levels. He still preferred level 7, but now he knew the others existed. Varro began visiting the kiln house twice a week. At first, he claimed he was checking the gate tokens. Then he began bringing stone samples. We tested clay layers between stone blocks, clay seals around metal joints, and flexible sigils beneath carved barriers. He taught me how stone carried mana over long distances. I taught him that a crack was not always a failure. Sometimes it was a warning placed exactly where you could see it. Our rivalry became useful. Instructor Neem said useful rivalries were rare and should be labeled carefully. Groundskeeper Amara allowed us to continue collecting small amounts of mound clay. In return, we maintained the rain channels and repaired damaged spirit figures. I became especially fond of restoring the old terracotta ancestors. Their long faces had been shaped by hands that disappeared centuries ago. Some wore bead collars, others held tools, bowls, staffs, or small animals. The academy once treated them as decoration. Our ash clay test showed that several figures still held traces of voices from the craftspeople who made them. Not words exactly, more like rhythm, pressure, and intention stored in the material. That discovery became the first page of my second notebook. The first notebook was already full. It contained 217 clay mixtures, 63 sigil patterns, 19 kiln schedules, and a stain from Bako's bean stew. I refused to remove the stain because he insisted it improved the mana flow. Some nights I still remembered my old world. I remembered electric lights, hot showers, packaged clay, and a kiln that controlled its own temperature. I wondered what had happened to the body I left behind. I wondered whether anyone had found the unfinished bowl on my work table. Those thoughts hurt, but they no longer made this world feel borrowed. Kito Balen's memories had become part of me. So had his parents' letter. So had the academy paths after rain, the library lamps at dusk, the smell of charcoal, Sira's careful bead trays, Bako's loud opinions, Instructor Neem's quiet approval, and the warm red cliffs beyond my window. At the end of the term, my parents visited. They entered through the gate my friends and I had repaired. My mother touched one of the glowing clay tokens and asked who had made it. When I told her, she looked at my father. He smiled. Not the proud smile people gave famous mages. the smaller one craftspeople gave when a roof survived the rain. That evening, the 5 of us ate stew outside the kiln house. Sira brought sweet tea. Bako brought bread and claimed he had not eaten any on the walk. Varro brought a basket of stone samples, which was not food but was apparently the best he could do. Instructor Neem brought a new notebook. We sat beneath warm lanterns while the gate hummed in the distance. I opened the notebook and wrote the date on the first page. Below it, I wrote a single question. What else has everyone misunderstood? I had crossed into a magical world expecting true power to look like fire, steel, or stone rising from the earth. Instead, I found it in clay, patient enough to yield, strong enough to endure, and quiet enough to remember every hand that helped shape it.